I had never been the suspicious type. For 14 years, Sara and I had built what I thought was a good marriage. Steady, practical, and full of the little routines that come to define a shared life. Each morning, I got up for my shift as a paramedic in downtown Austin, and Sara prepared for her work in finance, a demanding job that often kept her late. Our kids, Nate and Grace, knew their routines too, and the four of us settled into a rhythm that, though not perfect, was familiar. But that morning felt different. Sara moved around our bedroom with a briskness that was almost clinical, gathering her things into a small overnight bag with precise movements, barely looking at me. She was leaving on a quick trip, a single night away, something her work called for every now and then. She'd been vague about the destination, saying only that she'd be back before dinner tomorrow. I'd shrugged it off at the time, assuming it was just another one of those last-minute things that came with her job. As she reached for her bag, I noticed her hand bare. She wasn't wearing her wedding ring. I couldn't remember a time she had ever left home without it, not even for an hour. My first instinct was to ask about it, but as I watched her smooth her skirt over her hips, I stopped myself. A stray thought crept into my mind, one I didn't want to consider. But I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. There was no familiar glint of her ring, and her skirt, something about it struck me as odd. A moment later, it hit me, she wasn't wearing any underwear. I swallowed the unsettling feeling rising in my chest, and without thinking, reached for her hand to pull her closer. She gave me a half-smile, but her eyes were distant, somewhere else entirely. "Going without your ring today, huh?" I asked lightly, trying to make it sound like a joke, though my voice felt tight. She looked down at her hand, blinking as if she hadn't noticed. "Oh, must have forgotten it," she replied, her voice smooth but strangely dismissive. She didn't make a move to go back for it. Instead, she shrugged, almost to herself, as if the ring were a small, trivial detail. "And no underwear?" I added, keeping my tone as casual as I could manage, though the question left my mouth before I'd even thought about it. Sara's lips curled into a slight smile, one that felt almost practiced, like it was meant to convey some private amusement. She leaned in close, her perfume lingering in the air between us. "You'll understand soon enough," she murmured, her voice soft, playful, but with an edge I couldn't place. Then, without another word, she picked up her bag and turned toward the door, moving with the same strange precision she'd shown all morning. I stood there, feeling rooted to the floor, watching her go. My stomach twisted, and 100 unspoken questions buzzed in my mind. I thought about asking her to stay, about pressing her to explain this cryptic behavior. But in the end, I stayed silent, listening as her footsteps faded down the hallway. When the front door clicked shut, I found myself staring at the spot where she'd been standing. Something wasn't right, and it wasn't just the ring or the missing underwear, though those details gnawed at me. It was the way she'd looked at me, or rather, the way she hadn't. The entire morning, she'd avoided meeting my eyes, as if she were holding something back. I spent the rest of the day in a daze. My thoughts kept circling back to that moment in the bedroom, playing it over in my mind like a scene from a movie. The way she'd smiled, almost taunting, her soft, cryptic words, "You'll understand soon enough." What was that supposed to mean? Around noon, I decided I couldn't keep these thoughts to myself. I needed an outside perspective, someone who knew me well enough to tell me if I was overreacting. That's when I called Laura. Laura and I had been friends for years, ever since she'd helped me through a rough patch after my mother passed. She was sharp, straightforward, and as a private investigator, knew a thing or two about reading between the lines. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it was her. Laura picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Evan," she greeted, her tone warm but focused as usual. "What's up?" "Hey, Laura, you got a minute?" I tried to sound casual, but the words came out too fast. "Sure," she replied, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "Everything okay?" I paused, struggling to put my thoughts into words without sounding paranoid. It's Sara. She left this morning on a business trip, but there were a few things that, I don't know, felt off." Laura was quiet, waiting for me to continue. She didn't wear her wedding ring. I went on, feeling foolish as I said it. "And this might sound strange, but she wasn't wearing any underwear." I heard Laura's soft intake of breath on the other end. You're saying this isn't normal for her? No, not at all. It's just, well, it's not her. She's always been. I struggled to find the right word, put together. Careful. Interesting, Laura replied, her tone measured. And she didn't offer any explanation? Not really. Just said I'd understand soon enough. I could practically see Laura raising an eyebrow on the other end of the line. I knew how it sounded, and hearing myself say it aloud made the whole thing feel even stranger. Evan, Laura said after a moment's pause, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but if something feels wrong, it probably is. I could look into it. Discreetly, of course. I hesitated, glancing around the kitchen, as if I might find the answer in the ordinary clutter of breakfast dishes and kids' backpacks. Was I really about to ask Laura to dig into my wife's life? Would you mind? I asked almost too quietly. Not at all, she replied firmly. If there's nothing to find, then you'll have peace of mind. But if there is, well, we'll handle that too. Her calm, practical tone settled me, though a part of me felt like I'd crossed some invisible line. We spoke briefly about logistics, the places she would start. Laura assured me she'd be subtle, just a quick check on where Sara had gone for her trip, maybe a few follow-ups if anything looked out of the ordinary. She made it sound so straightforward, almost routine, as if this was no different from any other case. After we hung up, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I knew Laura would find the truth, whatever it was, and maybe I'd finally understand the reason behind that distant look in Sara's eyes. The morning after Sara's strange departure was unforgiving. We were hit with back-to-back calls, and each case seemed more complicated than the last. I was barely keeping up, and every jolt of the ambulance over the Austin roads felt like another knock against the sense of normalcy I'd been struggling to hold on to since Sara's departure. The pain started midway through a long shift, subtle at first, a dull ache that I brushed off. But by early afternoon, it had grown sharper, and I could no longer ignore it. I gritted my teeth through the rest of the call, and by the time we were back at the station, my coworker Sam had noticed me wincing. You all right there, Evan? He asked, his eyes narrowing with concern. Yeah, just something's off, I mumbled, trying to sound casual, though the pain was intensifying. I felt a sudden, sharp pang, and I couldn't keep it in. I doubled over, clutching my side. Sam's expression shifted instantly. You need to get that checked out. Don't mess around with something like that. He was right, of course. Ignoring it would be stupid, so I decided to head to the clinic. As luck would have it, Marcus was working that day. Marcus, Laura's brother, had been my physician for years, and I trusted him completely. I figured he'd take one look, tell me it was something minor, and send me home with a prescription. Marcus greeted me with his usual calm professionalism, his brow creased with concern as he took down my symptoms. Pain, sharp and sudden, huh? He asked, noting everything carefully. Anything else unusual? I hesitated, feeling the heat creep up my neck. Yeah, there's some, discharge. Doesn't look normal. His expression shifted, and a flicker of worry crossed his face. All right, Evan. Let's run a few tests, just to be safe. The waiting was excruciating. I sat alone in the sterile exam room, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over every sterile surface. Every passing minute, my mind wandered back to Sara's cryptic words. You'll understand soon enough. I didn't want to make any assumptions, but a dark thought was already taking root. When Marcus finally returned, his face was serious, his usual relaxed demeanor gone. He closed the door behind him, his hand resting on the doorknob for a second longer than usual. Evan, he said, his voice carefully measured, the tests came back, and well, you've tested positive for gonorrhea. The words hung in the air between us, strange and incomprehensible. I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. Gonorrhea? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. How is that possible? Marcus's face softened with sympathy, but he kept his tone professional. I know this isn't easy to hear, but you're going to need antibiotics, and, well, any recent sexual partners should be tested as well. I sat there, stunned, my mind scrambling to make sense of this. I knew the answer before I even allowed myself to think it. There was only one person it could have come from. Sara. I forced myself to speak, even though the words felt heavy in my throat. It's just been me and Sara, Marcus. No one else. Ever. Marcus nodded, understanding the implication. Then, you'll need to talk to her, Evan. This isn't something that just happens. The reality hit me like a freight train. Sara had given me an STD. It was the only explanation, and as much as I wanted to dismiss it, I knew that I couldn't ignore the facts. The woman I'd trusted, the mother of my children, she had been with someone else. Recently, if this diagnosis was any indication. Evan. Marcus's voice broke through my thoughts, pulling me back. Are you okay? I shook myself out of the daze, managing a nod. Yeah, I just need a minute. Marcus placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice filled with quiet understanding. Take all the time you need, and if you need to talk, you know where to find me. I nodded, barely hearing him as he left the room. The silence pressed down on me, each second ticking by as the reality of what this meant settled in. I needed answers. I couldn't let this go, not after everything I'd already started to suspect. Once I'd gathered myself enough to stand, I left the clinic and made my way to the car. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone, staring at Sara's contact photo on the screen. I hesitated, then hit call. The phone rang once, twice, and then her voice came on the line, chipper and light, as if nothing were wrong. Hey, Evan, she said, her tone casual. What's up? I gritted my teeth, forcing my voice to stay steady. Sara, where are you? Still on the trip, of course. Why? She replied, her tone unchanged, almost too smooth. I took a deep breath. I went to the doctor today. Got some unexpected news. There was a pause, just a fraction of a second too long. Oh, is everything okay? Not really, I said, my voice cold. I tested positive for gonorrhea. The silence on the other end was so complete, I could almost hear her breathing. Finally, she spoke, her tone wary. What are you implying, Evan? I felt a surge of anger, a raw, visceral feeling I hadn't known I was capable of. You know exactly what I'm implying, Sara. There's no other explanation. She hesitated, then let out a soft, incredulous laugh. Evan, you sound insane. Maybe you should think this through. Think this through? I replied, my voice rising despite myself. What is there to think through? You gave me an STD, Sara. This isn't a misunderstanding. Another pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had turned icy. I'll be back tomorrow night, Evan. We can discuss this then, but I would suggest you calm down. She hung up before I could respond. I stared at the screen, her name still flashing as if mocking me, taunting me with every unanswered question. I felt like I'd been dropped into some alternate reality, one where everything I believed was just a convenient lie. Without thinking, I dialed Laura. She picked up after a single ring. Evan? What happened? She asked, immediately sensing the urgency in my silence. It's worse than I thought, Laura, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. I tested positive for gonorrhea. The line went quiet, and then she let out a soft, steadying breath. Evan, I'm so sorry, but this confirms it, doesn't it? It does, I replied bitterly. Sara, she's been with someone else. There's no other way. Laura's voice grew firm, a steely edge to it that reminded me why I'd called her in the first place. All right, then it's time we take this a step further. I'll need everything you can give me. The time she's been away, any unusual expenses, anything that might point us in the right direction. I nodded, feeling the first hint of determination amidst the whirlwind of betrayal. I'll get it all together tonight. Whatever you need. Good. I'll start working on it right away, she said, a hint of reassurance in her tone. We'll find out the truth, Evan, no matter what it takes. I didn't sleep that night. The house was still and dark, each ticking second punctuated by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint snoring from Nate's room. My mind buzzed with questions, each more painful than the last. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought I had, all of it now felt like a carefully constructed lie. But I was no longer content to sit in the dark, wondering. I needed answers, and I needed them now. Early the next morning, I called Laura. I think it's time we look at her finances, I said, my voice a flat echo of itself. Laura didn't hesitate. I'll come by. Bring everything you have, tax returns, credit card statements, anything with her name on it. I'll find whatever she's been hiding. By midday, we were sitting at my kitchen table, documents spread between us like a twisted puzzle that only Laura had the skill to decipher. She moved quickly, her eyes scanning numbers and figures with the precision of a detective sifting through clues at a crime scene. Did she handle most of the financial stuff? She asked, barely looking up. Yeah, Sarah's in finance, after all. It made sense at the time, I replied, feeling the sting of my own naivety. I trusted her completely, never questioning what she did with our accounts. Laura's hand froze over a recent credit card statement. Her eyes narrowed as she skimmed over a series of transactions I hadn't noticed before. Large sums spent at high-end boutiques, jewelry stores, and exclusive hotels I didn't recognize. Evan, look at this, she said, sliding the statement across the table. I leaned over, squinting at the list of transactions, each more damning than the last. Charges for luxury jewelry, designer clothes, and even a stay at the Ritz-Carlton in New Orleans. My pulse quickened as the pieces started falling into place. New Orleans? I muttered, feeling a rush of memories. The night she'd been away, claiming to be at some mandatory conference. The phone calls where she sounded just a bit too distant. Doesn't seem like standard business travel, does it? Laura's voice was steady, but her expression told me everything. She was seeing the same pattern I was. This was no innocent business trip. Laura continued flipping through records, but something in her eyes shifted when she reached a certain set of documents. She went silent for a long moment, studying a page with a sharp intensity. Evan, there's a brokerage account here. In her name only, she said quietly, her finger tracing down the figures. And it's not small. We're talking over $3.5 million. I could barely process the number. 3.5? How? When did she even? I don't know yet, Laura said, flipping through the records to piece together the timeline. But it's been accruing for years, maybe 5 or more. And the deposits are substantial. These aren't from your shared income alone. The realization hit me hard. Sara had been hiding money, amassing it quietly while I stayed in the dark. The number alone felt like a slap in the face, but the implications were even worse. This was intentional, planned. I stared at the papers, the figures blurring as the weight of it settled over me. Wait, Laura said, her brow furrowing as she read further down the statement. There's another strange detail here. She's been moving funds to a secondary account. Could be for investments or something else. Something else? I echoed, feeling the edge of a deeper betrayal lurking just beyond my reach. Laura continued reading, a frown deepening on her face. This second account shows frequent withdrawals. Some large, some small, all inconsistent. What do you think she's using it for? I asked, though I already had a sinking feeling that I knew. Could be anything, she replied, her voice calm, but her gaze hard. But paired with those jewelry charges and luxury hotels, it doesn't look like she's saving up for family expenses, that's for sure. As I processed her words, my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at the screen. Sara. Her name felt foreign now, as if it belonged to someone I'd once known but couldn't recognize anymore. I picked up, letting the silence on the line stretch for a beat before speaking. Sara, I said, my voice as cold as I could manage. Hey, she replied, a strange mixture of irritation and impatience in her tone. I'm coming back tonight. We can talk then. I don't see why you had to make such a big deal out of this. I felt the anger rising, the careful restraint I'd held slipping with each word she spoke. A big deal? Sara, you lied to me. About more than just a trip. I'm looking at our bank statements right now. The jewelry, the hotels, New Orleans, Miami. You think I'm just going to shrug that off? There was a pause on her end, and when she spoke again, her voice was defensive. Evan, you don't understand. There's more to this than you know. Then tell me, Sara, I challenged, my patience running thin. Explain it to me. Make me understand. But she only sighed, exasperated. Look, it's not what you think, isn't it? Then why do I keep finding more lies? I could barely contain the fury boiling in my chest. You've been hiding things from me, Sara. And it's not just the money. It's everything. Another long silence, punctuated by a frustrated exhale. I'll explain when I get home, all right? Don't do anything rash. Just wait. The line went dead before I could respond. I set the phone down, staring at the screen as if it could give me the answers Sara wouldn't. Laura's gaze hadn't left me. That woman has secrets, Evan. Big ones. And I'm willing to bet she'll keep dodging you as long as she thinks you'll let her. Well, I'm done waiting, I said, my voice firm. If she wants to keep hiding, I'll find out the truth myself. Laura nodded, her expression shifting to a look of resolve. Then let's see how deep this goes. I'll put some feelers out, checking her trips to New Orleans and Miami. People leave a trail, even if they think they're being clever. I watched her gather the statements, her focus unwavering, her determination a sharp contrast to the uncertainty I felt. There was a reason I'd called Laura. She'd always been the one to see things clearly, to cut through the noise and find the truth. And now, as she worked, I could feel a glimmer of hope. At least I wasn't alone in this. The next few days were a whirlwind of revelations, each one pulling me deeper into a truth I wished I could ignore. I barely recognized the life I was seeing unfold before me, a life Sara had hidden behind a polished exterior, a life I was only now beginning to piece together. Laura was relentless. By the third day, she not only combed through every bit of financial evidence, but also enlisted a few trusted colleagues who specialized in surveillance. They were discreet, professionals who knew how to capture people at their most vulnerable, and before long, they were feeding Laura and me photos, recordings, and more questions than answers. I met Laura in her office one evening after work. Her face was unreadable as she motioned for me to sit, pulling a thick manila folder onto the desk between us. She watched me, letting the silence settle before speaking. "Evan," she began, her tone cautious but firm, "what I'm about to show you, I need you to be prepared. This isn't going to be easy." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in my gut. "Show me. I need to know everything." Laura opened the folder, revealing a stack of glossy photographs. Sara, dressed sharply, seated across from a man in an upscale bar. Her expression was animated, a flirtatious smile on her face that I barely recognized. The man was leaning in close, his hand resting lightly on her arm as they laughed together. The photo might have looked innocent at first glance, but the intimacy between them was unmistakable. "That's one of her friends," Laura said, her voice edged with barely contained anger. "His name's Alex. He's a hedge fund manager. Married, 2 kids." I clenched my jaw, staring at the photo, my hands itching to rip it apart. "How long has this been going on?" "Hard to say exactly, but from what I've pieced together, at least a year. They've met up in New Orleans and Miami, those business trips she told you about." I gritted my teeth. A year. She'd been lying to me for a year. And that wasn't even the end of it. I could feel it in the way Laura looked at me, as if she were still holding back the worst of it. "There's more, isn't there?" I managed, my voice barely a whisper. Laura sighed, flipping to the next set of photos. This time, Sara was with a different man. This one younger, with a sharp, clean-cut look that seemed out of place for her. They were leaving a hotel together, her arm linked through his as they laughed about something, oblivious to the world around them. "This is Jason," Laura said, her tone flat. "He's in corporate finance like Sara. Unmarried, though he's been spotted with other women too. They're reckless. Sloppy." This wasn't even the only hotel they used. I stared at the images, each one more damning than the last, and felt a numbness spreading through me. This wasn't just a fling. It was a lifestyle, one she'd hidden with the same efficiency she applied to everything in her life. Laura placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "There's more," she said softly, pulling out a transcript of a recorded conversation. "I debated whether to show you this, but I think you need to hear it." She handed me a small recorder, and I pressed play, my heart pounding as Sara's voice filled the room. "Evan? Oh, he's harmless. Clueless, really," she was saying, her voice carrying a mocking lilt that made my blood run cold. He's a good father, I guess, but honestly, he's the dullest part of my life. The kids? They're a handful, but Evan takes care of them, so they're mostly out of my hair." There was laughter in the background, a man's voice, probably Alex's, agreeing, egging her on. "So what do you get out of it?" he asked, his voice laced with amusement. What can I say? Sara replied with a shrug in her voice. It's comfortable. Safe. I get my life, he gets to play the doting husband, and he never questions anything. The recording cut off, and I sat there, the bile rising in my throat. I couldn't believe what I'd heard. My wife, the mother of my children, talking about me as though I were some convenient accessory, a fixture in her carefully crafted life. I'm sorry, Evan, Laura said softly. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. I forced myself to speak, my voice raw. How could she do this? All this time, she's been living a double life, Laura finished for me, her voice edged with anger. And she's dragged you, and the kids, into it without a second thought. There's no telling what she would have kept from you if we hadn't started looking. I stared at the images, each one a piece of a life I hadn't known existed, a web of lies Sara had spun so effortlessly. And the thought of her speaking about me that way, mocking a life we'd built, was almost more than I could bear. Laura pulled out another document, a list of recent charges on Sara's credit card, alongside phone records showing late-night calls, all hours of the night, sometimes just minutes after I'd gone to bed. She's gotten careless, Evan. She's comfortable. She thinks she's untouchable. And Alex? I asked, bitterness creeping into my voice. Does his wife know? Laura shook her head. Not yet. I've got people following up on him, but it's just a matter of time. These things, they always come out, one way or another. I nodded, the anger hardening into something colder, more focused. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about protecting Nate and Grace, about making sure they didn't grow up in a house built on lies. And it was about making sure Sara understood just how deeply she'd betrayed us all. Laura leaned forward, her gaze steady. What do you want to do, Evan? This isn't just a case of infidelity. It's a pattern. It's her way of life. And she's not going to stop. I looked at her, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I knew there was no going back. Not after everything I'd seen, everything I'd heard. Sara had made her choice. Now it was time for me to make mine. Do whatever it takes, I said, my voice resolute. I need every piece of evidence, every phone call, every dollar she spent. I want to know everything. Laura nodded, her expression one of grim determination. You've got it. She won't see this coming. As I left Laura's office, the reality of what lay ahead settled over me. This wasn't just about confronting Sara anymore. This was about uncovering every secret, every hidden truth she'd buried beneath years of deception. And I knew, with a certainty that cut deeper than any wound, that I wouldn't stop until I'd exposed every last lie she'd told. I was done waiting. The evidence was overwhelming, and each new revelation had driven another wedge into the life I thought I knew. After days of silently steeling myself, I finally had enough. Sara would be home soon, and this time, I wouldn't let her sidestep the truth. The house was quiet that evening, almost stiflingly so. Nate and Grace were at my parents' for the weekend, giving me the space I needed for this confrontation. I heard the low rumble of Sara's car pull into the driveway. My pulse quickened, but I kept my resolve firm, rehearsing in my mind exactly how I'd approach her, how I'd lay it all out. Each lie, each betrayal, piece by piece. The front door opened, and Sara stepped in, her face brightening with a smile that seemed almost mocking now. Hey, she said casually, setting her bag down. You're up late. I nodded, watching her closely. We need to talk, Sara. She must have sensed something different in my tone, because the warmth faded from her expression, replaced by a guarded look. She moved slowly toward the kitchen, almost stalling, as if gathering her own defenses. What's this about? She asked, her voice carrying a forced nonchalance. I didn't bother to ease into it. I know about Alex. And Jason. The trips. The hotels. All of it. I held her gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to give her any room to twist her way out. Her eyes widened, just slightly, before she quickly masked it with a sneer. So you've been spying on me now? That's rich, Evan. Really shows how much you trust me. Trust, I replied, letting out a sharp laugh. Sara, you lied to me over and over. I gave you trust, and you shattered it. And now you want to turn this back on me? She crossed her arms, tilting her head in defiance. I don't owe you an explanation. If you've gone snooping through my life, that's on you. You wouldn't have found anything if you just left things alone. My anger simmered just beneath the surface, barely contained. Are you hearing yourself? I wouldn't have found anything if I just ignored the fact that you were cheating. You really think that's all this is? Her expression hardened, her jaw tightening. So what, Evan? What are you going to do about it? You think you have some kind of moral high ground because you've been the perfect little husband? Well, newsflash, I never asked you to play that role. The words stung, but I didn't back down. And what about Nate and Grace? Did they ask for this? For you to bring this mess into their lives? She rolled her eyes, waving a hand dismissively. They'll be fine. They don't need to know every little thing about us. They're kids, Evan. They'll believe whatever we tell them. I felt a surge of cold resolve. They'll know Sara. They'll know who kept this family together and who tore it apart. A flicker of panic crossed her face, and she quickly replaced it with anger. You think you're going to take them from me? Her voice rose, laced with incredulity. I'm their mother, Evan. Whatever lies you want to believe about me, you can't take that away. Maybe not, I replied, my tone steady. But I'm done playing by your rules. I'm going to file for divorce, Sara, and I'm going to fight for custody. For a moment, I thought I saw fear flash in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a cold, almost amused smile. You think you're going to waltz into a courtroom and win this? Evan, you don't have a clue how this works. You're a paramedic, not a lawyer. Do you think anyone's going to believe you over me? I felt a renewed anger at her arrogance, her refusal to acknowledge any fault. I don't need to be a lawyer, I said firmly. Laura's already guiding me through everything. And with the evidence we have, you won't have the leverage you think you do. Her smile faltered at the mention of Laura's name, but she quickly recovered, crossing her arms defiantly. Evidence? What, some grainy photos and phone records? You're delusional, Evan. And you know what? Maybe I'll tell the kids a little story of my own. Maybe I'll tell them that their father has been seeing someone else. You think they'd believe you over me? The threat hung in the air, a cruel glint in her eye as she watched my reaction. My blood ran cold, but I kept my voice steady. Go ahead, Sara. Try it. But I'm done letting you manipulate everyone around you. I'm not scared of your games anymore. She laughed, shaking her head. You think you're so righteous. But you don't know half of what goes on, Evan. Maybe it's time you get a taste of reality. I took a step closer, refusing to let her words sway me. I've seen enough of your reality, and I'm not letting you drag me or the kids any deeper into it. She took a step back, momentarily unnerved, but her face quickly hardened into a mask of defiance. You think you're so strong, so moral, but you're going to learn that the world isn't as black and white as you like to believe, Evan. I watched her, feeling a strange calm settle over me. It's not about black and white, Sara. It's about what's right and what you've done to this family. You can keep lying to yourself, but I'm done listening. She shook her head, a scornful smile twisting her lips. Fine, go ahead and file your little papers. See what good it does you. You're nothing without me, Evan. You'll come crawling back eventually. Without another word, she grabbed her bag and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The echo of it hung in the air, a final punctuation on a conversation that had been years in the making. I stood there, the silence settling around me, and for the first time, I felt an unfamiliar sense of clarity. I knew what I had to do. There was no going back now. I picked up my phone and dialed Laura. The decision solidified in my mind. When she answered, I didn't hesitate. Laura, I'm ready. Let's file. The courtroom felt like an entirely different world, cold, impartial, its walls lined with formality and judgment. The past weeks had blurred together in a relentless tide of paperwork, court dates, and legal negotiations that seemed endless. But today marked the conclusion, the point where Sara and I would each face the reality we had set in motion. The judge delivered the ruling without fanfare. Primary custody of Nate and Grace awarded to me, with Sara receiving visitation rights, subject to review. Her hidden funds, the ones she'd amassed over the years, were divided between us, with half directed into a trust for the kids' future. Sara sat across the aisle, her face set in a mask of indifference, though I saw the tension etched around her mouth, the rigid set of her shoulders. She was a stranger now, the person I'd shared a life with somehow lost behind those carefully constructed expressions. When the gavel struck, marking the end, she didn't meet my eyes. She gathered her things and left the courtroom without a word. Outside, Laura met me with a brief, supportive nod. "It's done," she said, her voice steady. "You got what you came for, Evan. This is a new beginning." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. It was over, but as I walked to my car, I realized this was just the start of a different journey, one where the focus was on building something real again, something steady and safe for Nate and Grace. Back home, life took on a new rhythm. The house felt lighter, the weight of secrets and tension finally lifted. Nate and Grace, sensing the changes but too young to understand them completely, adjusted quickly to the new normal. They asked about Sara from time to time, and each time I told them the truth in doses they could handle, giving them what they needed without burdening them with the messiness of it all. One afternoon, a few months after the court ruling, I opened the mailbox to find a letter. It was in a plain envelope, no return address, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside was a single page, a letter from Alex, one of Sara's former lovers. The words were written with an air of reluctance, as if he debated long and hard before deciding to send it. He started with an apology, though it was laced with excuses, claims of ignorance, statements that he hadn't known about her family, about her children. But as the letter continued, his tone shifted, his words confessing a new layer of deceit I hadn't anticipated. He mentioned that Sara had once spoken about moving assets abroad, preparing a safety net in case things went wrong. I sat there, reading the words in stunned silence, feeling a strange sense of vindication. There was no shock, no anger, just the cold, clinical understanding that I had barely scratched the surface of Sara's hidden world. It was like seeing a puzzle completed, the final pieces slipping into place, confirming the lengths she'd gone to secure a life separate from ours. For a brief moment, I thought about following up, digging further to track down these hidden funds, but I let the thought drift away. It no longer mattered. I'd secured what Nate and Grace needed, what I needed. The rest was just remnants of a life I no longer cared to understand. Days turned into weeks, and the sharp edges of the past began to dull. With each passing day, I became more focused on the life I was rebuilding with the kids. I made sure I was there for every soccer game, every school recital, every homework struggle at the kitchen table. I realized that in protecting them from Sara's betrayals, I had become the constant they relied on, the unwavering presence that kept their world grounded. Sara reached out occasionally, asking to see the kids. I kept our exchanges brief, businesslike, and when she did visit, I stayed close, always careful to step in if her influence seemed to linger too long. Over time, her visits grew less frequent. Whether it was guilt, shame, or something else I didn't know, and I no longer cared to speculate. One evening, after tucking Nate and Grace into bed, I sat alone in the quiet of the house, feeling a deep sense of calm for the first time in months. The shadows on the walls no longer felt oppressive, and the silence was no longer filled with the weight of unanswered questions. I was finally free of the lies that had once bound me. And as I sat there, I realized something important. I wasn't just moving on, I was moving forward toward a future I could shape on my own terms, with a clarity that only the truth could provide. I had learned the strength of resilience, the necessity of trust, and, most importantly, the unbreakable bond one shared with my children. Sara's chapter in my life had ended, and I had no intention of reopening it. For the first time in years, I felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, I would face it head on, guided by the lessons I'd earned the hard way.